The year is 1944. June. While American bombers darken the skies over France and Soviet tanks grind toward Poland, something extraordinary is happening in the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. Something that defies every law of wartime logic. America is pouring more steel into refrigerators than Nazi Germany is pouring into tanks. Not metaphorically. Literally. The numbers don't lie. In the same months when the Wehrmacht desperately needs every panzer it can build, when German tank crews are writing home about equipment shortages that will cost them their lives, American families are walking into Sears and Montgomery Ward to buy gleaming white refrigerators with chrome handles and automatic defrost. The steel that could have built a Tiger tank is instead becoming the cool, humming heart of an Ohio kitchen. How is this possible? How can a nation at war spend more industrial might on food preservation than its enemy spends on the very machines of conquest? The answer will shock you. Because this isn't a story about misplaced priorities. It's a story about how America discovered something the Nazis never understood, that the ability to build both comfort and destruction simultaneously was the ultimate weapon. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel so these stories live on. Picture this scene. It's a Tuesday morning in Akron, Ohio. Margaret Henderson is signing the papers for a new General Electric refrigerator. 8 cubic feet of storage space. Automatic temperature control. The salesman promises it will last 20 years. At this exact moment, 4,000 miles away, Hauptmann Klaus Weber of the 2nd SS Panzer Division is watching his Tiger tank sputter to a stop outside Caen. The transmission has failed again. It's the third breakdown this week. The replacement parts were supposed to arrive from the Henschel factory in Kassel, but the factory was bombed last month. Now they're melting down captured Soviet tanks just to get enough steel for repairs. Weber doesn't know it yet, but the refrigerator Margaret Henderson is buying contains more processed steel than the emergency repairs his crew will attempt with salvaged metal. This is not an aberration. This is the pattern of 1944. The numbers are staggering. In 1944, American factories produced 1.2 million refrigerators for domestic consumption. Each unit required approximately 150 pounds of rolled steel, not counting the compressor components. That's 180 million pounds of steel. In the same year, Germany's entire tank production, Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, everything, consumed approximately 165 million pounds of steel. Let that sink in. While German workers were ordered to surrender their pots and pans to be melted down for the war effort, while Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels was broadcasting appeals for citizens to donate any metal they could spare, American housewives were choosing between Frigidaire and Westinghouse models, debating whether they needed the larger freezer compartment. But here's where the story becomes even more incredible. America wasn't choosing refrigerators over tanks. America was building both. In that same year of 1944, while those 1.2 million refrigerators rolled off assembly lines, American factories also produced 29,497 tanks. 29,000. Germany managed 8,328. The United States built 96,318 aircraft. Germany built 39,807. The Americans produced 2.6 million trucks. Germany built 88,000. America launched 127 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Germany launched 15 U-boats. And here's the detail that German intelligence could never quite believe when they intercepted American production reports. All of this was happening while American factories were simultaneously producing washing machines, automobiles for civilian use, radios, record players, and yes, those refrigerators that contained more steel than Tiger tanks. Listen to the voice of Hans Müller, a German factory worker at the Krupp Steel Works in Essen, writing in his diary in August 1944, "Today we received orders to increase production by 30%. Impossible. We have no coal. The British bombed the rail yards again last night. We are melting down fence posts and old machinery. Yesterday, I saw them removing the iron gates from the cemetery. My daughter asks why we work such long hours, and I cannot tell her it is so we can build enough tanks to slow the enemy advance. How can I tell her that the Americans build tanks as an afterthought? That they have so much steel, so much coal, so much of everything that they can afford to use it on luxuries while still drowning us in weapons. This is not warfare as we understand it. This is something else entirely. The refrigerator production lines never stopped. Not once. While German factories operated in darkness to avoid Allied bombers, while German workers stumbled through blackouts and air raid sirens, the Frigidaire plant in Dayton, Ohio ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, electric lights blazing through the night. The workers, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before Pearl Harbor, earned enough in wages to buy the very refrigerators they were building. Think about that psychology for a moment. You're building the instrument of your own prosperity. Every rivet you place, every sheet of steel you bend, brings you closer to owning the modern convenience you're creating. Compare that to the German worker, exhausted, underfed, knowing that every tank he builds will likely be destroyed within weeks of reaching the front, knowing that even if it survives, it will never be enough. The steel itself tells the story. American steel in 1944 was an embarrassment of riches. The great furnaces of Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana produced 89 million tons that year. 89 million. Germany, even with the captured industries of France, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, managed 25 million tons. And much of that German steel was inferior, contaminated with impurities because they were melting down everything they could find: old railroad tracks, captured weapons, church bells. Yes, church bells. In hundreds of German towns in 1944, the bells that had rung for centuries, that had marked births and deaths and marriages for generations, were pulled down from their towers and fed into the furnaces. The metal that had once called people to prayer was reformed into tank armor that would be pierced by American shells made from virgin steel, pure and abundant. There's a letter from an American soldier, Private First Class Joseph Toretti from Brooklyn, written to his wife in September 1944. He's just fought through the hedgerows of Normandy. You wouldn't believe the German tanks we've been facing. Tigers, they call them. Monsters. Armor thick as your fist. But here's the thing, honey, there's never enough of them. We knocked out 3 yesterday, and that was all they had for the whole sector. 3. We had 17 Shermans, and that was just our company. The boys are saying that for every Tiger they build, we build 100 tanks. I don't know if that's true, but it feels true. And get this, Johnny got a letter from his wife saying she just bought a new refrigerator. A refrigerator? While we're over here shooting at Germans, she's shopping for kitchen appliances. Only in America, right? He was right about the ratios, almost. For every Tiger tank Germany produced in 1944, and they only built 623 Tigers that entire year, America built 47 tanks of various types. But here's the extraordinary detail that Private Toretti didn't know. His wife back in Brooklyn could buy that refrigerator because America had made a calculated decision. The war would be won not just with weapons, but with morale. Not just with tanks, but with the promise of prosperity. Every refrigerator humming in an American kitchen was proof that this war was different from the last one. This wasn't about mere survival. This was about building a future so abundant that you could fight the largest war in human history while simultaneously upgrading your kitchen. The German High Command knew about the refrigerators. They had intelligence reports. They had intercepted American newspapers advertising the latest models from General Electric, perfect for the modern family. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, wrote in a memorandum that the American production figures must be propaganda, that no nation could possibly waste steel on consumer goods during total war. He was wrong. It wasn't waste. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. Because what destroys morale more thoroughly, knowing your enemy has more tanks, or knowing your enemy has so many resources that tanks are just one item on a very long production list that includes ice cream makers and lawn mowers? In the Ruhr Valley, the heart of German steel production, workers in 1944 were collapsing from malnutrition. 12-hour shifts on a diet of turnips and black bread. The calories needed to swing a hammer to pour molten steel simply weren't available. Production fell not because of lack of will, but lack of food. Meanwhile, in Detroit, factory cafeterias served pot roast and apple pie. The Frigidaire plant had a subsidized lunch program, 25 cents for a full meal. The workers building refrigerators ate better than the engineers designing Tiger tanks. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic. A well-fed worker could maintain precision, could innovate, could suggest improvements to the production line that might save seconds on each unit, adding up to thousands of extra refrigerators by year's end. Consider the story of Emma Watson, a former school teacher who started working at the Westinghouse plant in Columbus, Ohio in 1943. By 1944, she was a line supervisor, overseeing the installation of compressor units. Her team developed a new assembly method that cut production time by 12%. She received a bonus of $50, enough to put a down payment on one of the refrigerators she was building. Her brother was killed in Italy that same month, fighting at Monte Cassino. When she received the telegram, she didn't stop working. She later wrote, "Every refrigerator we built was proof that Tommy didn't die for nothing. He died so that American families could live in comfort, could raise their children in prosperity. The Germans were fighting to survive. We were fighting to thrive." The refrigerators themselves were masterpieces of engineering excess. The 1944 General Electric model featured copper tubing, copper that could have gone into shell casings. It had rubber door seals, rubber that could have become tank treads. The electric motor used precision ball bearings that were identical to those used in aircraft engines. America had so much industrial capacity that it could use military-grade components in household appliances and never feel the shortage. German tanks, meanwhile, were being fitted with inferior bearings that would fail after a few hundred miles. The Panther tank, Germany's most sophisticated medium tank, had a final drive so prone to break down that crews carried spare parts that they knew would fail, hoping to limp from one repair to the next. Let me tell you about the night of October 15, 1944. In the city of Essen, home to the Krupp Armament Works, the air raid sirens wail at 9:47 p.m. British Lancasters are coming. Again. The workers flee to the shelters, leaving furnaces half-ended, steel cooling in the molds. Some of it will have to be scrapped, remelted, begun again. Time lost. Steel wasted. At this exact moment, 4,847 miles away in Detroit, the second shift at the Kelvinator factory is hitting its stride. The lights are bright. The radio is playing Glenn Miller. The workers are racing to beat the first shift's production numbers. There's a friendly competition, a case of beer for the winning team. They will build 237 refrigerators before midnight. Each one represents not just steel shaped into purpose, but confidence made manifest. The confidence to know that your factories will not be bombed. That your supply lines will not be cut. That tomorrow will come, and with it, more steel, more opportunity, more refrigerators. Support this work so the truth continues to reach people, and make sure you're subscribed. Because what I'm about to tell you next changes everything you thought you knew about industrial warfare. The refrigerator factories were also intelligence operations. Every unit shipped overseas to military bases came with detailed documentation about American industrial capacity. The Germans would capture these documents and realize, with growing horror, that the refrigerators keeping American field hospitals supplied with fresh blood plasma were just overflow production. Surplus. Excess capacity converted to military use almost as an afterthought. One captured German intelligence report from November 1944 states, the enemy's ability to maintain civilian production while conducting operations on two fronts defies all conventional military science. We must assume their published production figures are inflated by a factor of at least 3. They weren't inflated. If anything, they were understated. Here's a statistic that the German General Staff could never quite process. In 1944, the United States produced enough steel to build every single weapon used by all Allied forces, British, Soviet, American, Free French, everyone, and still had enough left over for those 1.2 million refrigerators, plus washing machines, plus automobiles, plus the structural steel for new factories that would produce even more in 1945. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately for survival, received 400,000 trucks from America. Britain received 88,000 aircraft. China received 1,000 tanks. And while all of this equipment was flowing overseas, American civilians bought 139,000 new automobiles. For pleasure. For driving to the beach on weekends. The psychology of abundance versus scarcity played out in every aspect of the war. German tank crews were taught to conserve ammunition, to make every shell count. American tank crews were taught to shoot first and keep shooting, there would always be more shells. German pilots were told to preserve their aircraft at all costs, the plane was more valuable than the mission. American pilots were told that planes were replaceable, complete the mission. German soldiers wore uniforms made from ersatz wool, mixed with wood pulp. American soldiers complained if their uniforms weren't comfortable enough. The complaints were taken seriously. Comfort meant morale. Morale meant victory. Listen to this diary entry from Feldwebel Kurt Hoffmann, tank commander in the 21st Panzer Division, December 1944, "We have been told that the Americans are soft, that their love of comfort makes them weak. But I have seen their supply depots. Mountains of ammunition. Fuel in quantities we can only dream of. Spare parts still in factory packaging. And yes, even refrigerators in their field kitchens. This is not softness. This is strength beyond imagination. We make heroes out of necessity, the driver who keeps a tank running with wire and prayers, the gunner who makes impossible shots with worn-out equipment. They don't need heroes. They have logistics. They have steel. They have so much steel that they can waste it on comfort and still bury us in shells." The refrigerator production lines became a kind of industrial poetry. The same spot welding techniques used to assemble Sherman tank hulls were used to create seamless refrigerator bodies. The same precision drilling that created aircraft engine components carved out the spaces for refrigerator compressors. The same assembly line innovations that Henry Ford had pioneered for automobiles now created kitchen appliances at speeds that defied belief. 1 refrigerator every 3 minutes. 20 an hour. 480 per shift. 1,440 per day. Every single day. Without pause. Without shortage. Without apology. The irony was excruciating for German planners. They had started the war with superiority in design. The Tiger tank was, arguably, the finest heavy tank ever built. But they could only build 1,354 Tigers during the entire war. Total. America built 49,234 Sherman tanks. The Shermans were inferior in single combat. Every tank crew knew it. It took 4 or 5 Shermans to reliably defeat 1 Tiger. But America could afford to lose 4 Shermans for every Tiger destroyed and still have tens of thousands left over. This wasn't combat. This was arithmetic. Cold, relentless, refrigerator-cold arithmetic. In February 1944, a young woman named Dorothy Phillips started working at the Frigidaire plant in Dayton. She had lost her husband at Guadalcanal. Her job was to install the temperature control dials. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, she attached the small metal disc that would allow American families to keep their milk cold, their vegetables fresh. She later said, "Every dial I installed was a small act of defiance against the idea that war meant deprivation. My husband died fighting Japanese soldiers who were starving on that island. We were building refrigerators." The contrast was obscene. It was also our greatest weapon. We could afford to think about the future, about comfort, about normal life. They could only think about survival. The German response to material shortage was ingenious but ultimately futile. They developed synthetic rubber that disintegrated after months. They created ersatz coffee from acorns that tasted like burnt wood. They designed tanks with interleaved wheels that were engineering marvels but maintenance nightmares. Every solution created two new problems. Meanwhile, American engineers were debating whether refrigerators should have rounded or square corners, whether the freezer compartment should be on top or bottom, whether the butter dish should be glass or plastic. These were the luxury problems of a nation that had already won the war, it just hadn't finished fighting it yet. Here's something that haunts me about this story. In the archives, there's a photograph from April 1944. It shows a German mother in Hamburg teaching her children to identify edible weeds in a bombed-out garden. They're collecting dandelion leaves for soup. On the same day this photo was taken, the Sears catalog in America was advertising the kitchen of tomorrow, available today, featuring a refrigerator-freezer combination unit with separate temperature controls for each compartment. The catalog sold 50,000 units by mail order alone. Mail order. While Germans were eating weeds, Americans were buying refrigerators through the post. The steel shortage in Germany became so acute that they began cannibalizing their own infrastructure. Railroad tracks from secondary lines were torn up to be melted down. Bridges were stripped of non-essential supports. In the city of Cologne, they removed the decorative iron fencing from the cathedral square metalwork that had stood since the 1890s to feed into the furnaces. Every pound of steel had to be justified, documented, allocated according to priority charts that changed weekly as the situation became more desperate. In America, steel allocation was also carefully managed. But the management included ensuring that the Westinghouse Corporation received its monthly allotment of 15,000 tons for household appliance production. The war would be won, but so would the peace. The most devastating comparison came in quality control. German tank factories in 1944 had rejection rates approaching 30%. 3 out of every 10 tanks had significant defects. Steel impurities caused armor to crack. Substandard bearings caused mechanical failures. Exhausted workers made mistakes that couldn't be caught because the inspectors were also exhausted. American refrigerator factories had rejection rates below 2%. The same refrigerator that Margaret Henderson bought in Akron in 1944 was still running in 1964. 20 years. Just as the salesman promised. The Tiger tank that broke down outside Caen didn't last 20 hours after its last repair. There's a memo from the Frigidaire Corporation to the War Production Board, dated July 1944. It requests permission to increase civilian refrigerator production by 20,000 units for the fourth quarter. The reasoning? Enhanced civilian morale through material comfort directly contributes to increased war production efficiency. The request was approved. In the same month, Albert Speer was begging Hitler to allow him to conscript 14-year-old boys for factory work because there simply weren't enough workers to maintain even reduced production levels. The boys were approved. Many of them died in the bombing raids that followed. The American production miracle wasn't just about having more resources. It was about using those resources to create a multiplier effect. Every refrigerator sold meant a family with higher morale. Higher morale meant better productivity. Better productivity meant more weapons, more ammunition, more of everything. It was a virtuous cycle powered by abundance. Germany was trapped in a vicious cycle powered by scarcity. Every shortage created more shortages. Every compromise weakened the whole system. By late 1944, German tank crews were being issued tanks with unpainted interiors because paint was too precious to waste on surfaces that wouldn't be seen by the enemy. An American intelligence officer, Major Thomas Bradley, wrote this assessment in November 1944: the enemy's collapse is not merely military but psychological. Captured officers express bewilderment that we can maintain such massive offensive operations while simultaneously supplying our forces with what they consider impossible luxuries. A German colonel asked me if it was true that American field hospitals had refrigeration units for blood storage. When I confirmed this, he said nothing for a full minute. Then he asked, "How can we defeat an enemy that can afford to refrigerate blood?" He had no answer. Neither did we. The refrigerators were simply there, like the shells and the tanks and the endless supply convoys. They existed because we could make them exist. Let me share with you the story of the Becker family from Munich. In December 1944, Herr Becker was working 16-hour shifts at the Messerschmitt aircraft factory. His wife was collecting scrap metal for the war effort. Their 12-year-old son was in the Hitler Youth, training to use a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. Their daughter, aged 10, spent her evenings knitting socks for soldiers at the front. Every moment of their existence was subordinated to the war effort. They had no refrigerator. They had no electricity most nights. They kept their meager food supplies in a cellar that flooded whenever it rained. On Christmas Eve 1944, their dinner was turnip soup and black bread. On that same evening, the Johnson family in Minneapolis was pulling a 20-pound turkey from their Frigidaire refrigerator, where it had been safely stored for a week. The turkey was stuffed with cornbread dressing. There were sweet potatoes with marshmallows, green beans with almonds, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of pie. The excess was carefully wrapped and placed back in the refrigerator for leftovers. The war seemed very far away. But here's the twist that makes this story even more remarkable. Those refrigerators weren't just symbols of abundance. They were weapons of post-war conquest. Every American refrigerator came with something the German models could never match, a vision of the future. When the war ended, when American troops occupied Germany, they brought their refrigerators with them. German civilians saw these machines and understood, instantly and viscerally, that they had lost more than a war. They had lost an entire conception of what modern life could be. The humming of American refrigerators in occupied Germany was the sound of a new world order being born. Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again. Because the final truth of 1944 is almost too strange to believe. The refrigerators outlasted everything. The Tiger tanks were destroyed or abandoned. The Panther tanks were captured or scrapped. The great factories of the Ruhr were reduced to rubble. The Third Reich collapsed into dust and shame. But those 1.2 million refrigerators built in 1944? Many of them ran for 30, 40, even 50 years. In apartments in Ohio, in farmhouses in Iowa, in suburban homes in California, they hummed on through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through decades of American prosperity. They preserved food and preserved something else, the memory of a time when America could build comfort and victory simultaneously, when the nation was so powerful that it could treat global war as just another production challenge to be solved with good engineering and plenty of steel. There's an epilogue to this story that deserves to be told. In 1974, 30 years after our story begins, an elderly German engineer named Wilhelm Hartmann emigrated to America. He had designed transmissions for Panther tanks during the war. His son had sponsored his immigration, and he moved into a small apartment in Chicago. The apartment came furnished with a refrigerator, a 1944 Westinghouse model, still running perfectly after 3 decades. Hartmann recognized the manufacturing date stamped on the compressor housing. He stood in that small kitchen, touching the smooth white surface of the machine, and wept. Later, he told his son, "I spent 1944 trying to make mechanisms of death that would last long enough to reach the battlefield." The Americans spent 1944 making mechanisms of life that would last forever. We never had a chance. The mathematics of that year still stagger the imagination. While Germany produced 8,328 tanks of all types, America produced 17,565 tanks just for the Soviet Union as Lend-Lease aid. While Germany struggled to manufacture 39,807 aircraft, America produced 96,318 aircraft and gave away 14,000 of them to allies. While German families surrendered their pots and pans to be melted for the war effort, American families were buying matching kitchen sets in pastel colors. The contrast wasn't just material. It was metaphysical. 2 different universes of possibility, existing in the same historical moment. I discovered something in the archives that I've never seen mentioned in any history book. The Frigidaire Corporation kept detailed records of their refrigerator sales, including customer addresses. In 1944, they sold 73 refrigerators to families who had received death notifications about soldiers killed in action. 73 Gold Star families, as they were known, who lost sons or husbands in Europe or the Pacific, and who still bought refrigerators. Because life continued. Because the future still needed to be planned for. Because in America in 1944, even grief could not stop the machinery of progress. There's something heartbreaking and magnificent about that fact, a widow in Indiana signing purchase papers for a kitchen appliance while her husband's body lies in a temporary grave in Italy. The German archives tell a different story. By November 1944, the Nazi regime had issued orders that any civilian caught hoarding food would be shot. Hoarding was defined as keeping more than 1 week's rations. But without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. So families were trapped in a cruel paradox: they couldn't preserve food legally, and they couldn't acquire fresh food regularly because the distribution system was collapsing. Meanwhile, American families were experimenting with something new: frozen foods. Clariant's bird's-eye flash freezing process had created an entirely new category of convenience. The 1944 refrigerators came with larger freezer compartments specifically designed to accommodate this innovation. Germans were starving. Americans were innovating new ways to store surplus food. The propaganda war was fought with steel as much as words. German newsreels showed determined workers forging weapons for final victory. American magazines showed happy homemakers arranging food in their new refrigerators. But here's what the propaganda couldn't hide: the sound. German factories sounded like exhaustion. The irregular rhythm of tired workers, the grinding of worn machinery, the silence when the power failed. American factories sounded like jazz. Literally. Many plants played music during shifts. The rhythm of production matched the rhythm of swing. Workers later remembered not specific days but specific songs. I installed compressors to in the mood and door hinges to Chattanooga Choo Choo. The refrigerators were built to a soundtrack of confidence. In the National Archives, there's a recording of a German propaganda broadcast from December 1944. The announcer declares that American war production is a myth, that no nation could possibly produce what America claims to produce. As evidence, he cites the absurd claim that America is manufacturing household appliances while fighting a global war. This is clearly impossible, he states with authority. No rational nation would waste precious materials on such frivolities during an existential struggle. The tragedy is that he genuinely couldn't conceive of abundance on that scale. His imagination had been limited by scarcity. He could not envision a world where you could have both guns and butter, both tanks and refrigerators, both victory and comfort. The refrigerator factories also tell a story about gender. By 1944, 60% of refrigerator assembly line workers were women. They built the machines that they would later use in their own homes. There was a kind of circular empowerment in this, earning wages to buy the appliances you yourself manufactured. German women were also working in factories, but they were building weapons they would never use, for a victory that would never come. The American women knew exactly what they were building and why it mattered. They were constructing the infrastructure of peacetime before the war was even over. Consider this letter from Mary Patterson, a line worker at General Electric, to her husband fighting in the Pacific. You asked what I'm building. It's refrigerators, Tom. Refrigerators. I know it sounds crazy with you out there fighting, but they say it's important for morale. And you know what? They're right. Every time I install a door handle, I imagine us after the war, in our own kitchen, you grabbing a cold beer from our own refrigerator. It keeps me going. It keeps all of us going. We're not just building appliances. We're building the future we're going to live in when you come home. The steel situation became so desperate in Germany that they began producing tanks with thinner armor, hoping that design improvements could compensate for material weakness. They couldn't. American tank crews reported that German tanks that should have been impervious to certain weapons were being destroyed by lighter shells. The vaunted German engineering was being undermined by simple material shortage. Meanwhile, American refrigerators were being built with excess steel, over-engineered for durability. The doors were reinforced. The frames were doubled. Why? Because they could be. Because the steel existed. Because abundance allowed for generosity of construction. In March 1945, as the Third Reich entered its final agony, the Frigidaire Corporation published its projections for peacetime production. They anticipated selling 2 million refrigerators in 1946. 2 million. The entire German tank production for the whole war had been roughly 50,000 vehicles. America was planning to build 40 times as many refrigerators in a single peacetime year as Germany had built tanks in 6 years of war. The scale is so absurd it becomes sublime. It's not a comparison of military might. It's a comparison of different universes of possibility. The last German tank factory to cease production was in Czechoslovakia in early May 1945. The workers, many of them slave laborers, simply walked away when they heard of Hitler's death. The partially completed vehicles were left on the assembly lines, ghosts of an industrial ambition that had consumed a continent. On that same day, May 8, 1945, the Westinghouse plant in Ohio completed its 100,000th refrigerator of the year. The workers were given a half-day holiday to celebrate VE Day. They would return the next morning to build more refrigerators. The war was over. The future had arrived, and it needed to be kept cold. But the story doesn't end with victory. It ends with a question that haunts me still. In the archives of the Frigidaire Corporation, there's a customer letter from 1947. It's from a woman in California who had purchased a refrigerator in 1944. She writes to praise the quality of the machine, mentioning that it has run continuously without a single repair. Then she adds this postscript: "My neighbor is a German war bride." She had never seen a refrigerator before coming to America. When I showed her mine and told her when it was made, she began to cry. She said her brother died in a Tiger tank in 1944. She said he wrote letters home about how the tank was always breaking down, how there were never enough spare parts. Now she stands in my kitchen sometimes, just listening to the hum of the refrigerator. She says it sounds like peace. That humming sound, that simple, mechanical humming of a compressor cycling on and off, that became the soundtrack of American victory. Not the roar of engines or the thunder of guns, but the quiet, consistent hum of refrigerators in millions of kitchens. Each one a small declaration of abundance. Each one proof that a nation could transform unimaginable quantities of steel into both swords and plowshares, both ammunition and appliances, both the machinery of death and the machinery of daily life. The final accounting is this: Germany lost the war not when their last tank was destroyed, but when they could no longer imagine a world of abundance. They had been reduced to seeing steel only as weapons, food only as survival, labor only as sacrifice. America won the war when it refused to accept that limitation. When it insisted that even in the midst of global catastrophe, even with millions of men overseas and casualties mounting daily, there was still enough steel, enough ambition, enough sheer industrial capacity to build refrigerators. To build comfort. To build the future. The quiet hum of American refrigerators lasted longer than the roar of German tanks. It lasts still, in museums and vintage shops and grandmothers' kitchens across the country. Those 1944 refrigerators, built while the world burned, stand as monuments to the strangest victory in military history, the victory of abundance over scarcity, of comfort over deprivation, of the assembly line over the battlefield. They won the war not by being weapons, but by being proof that weapons were not enough. That victory meant nothing without something to preserve, something to come home to, something to keep cold and fresh and ready for tomorrow. The steel remembers everything, the furnaces of Pittsburgh and the factories of Detroit, the assembly lines that never stopped and the workers who never surrendered to the logic of scarcity. In 1944, America spent more steel on refrigerators than Germany spent on tanks. That single fact contains within it the entire story of the 20th century, the entire meaning of American power, the entire tragedy of those who believed that war was only about weapons. The refrigerators knew better. They knew that war was about the future. And the future needed to stay fresh.